Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Fordham Intellectual Property, Media, and Entertainment Law Journal podcast at Fordham University School of Law. My name is Richard Fielkow, and I am joined by my colleague, Mike Regan. We are delighted to have Jeffrey Wachs with us. Jeffrey works at Netflix in their original films Business and Legal Affairs department. Before joining Netflix, he was the VP of Business and Legal Affairs at Lakeshore Entertainment, as well as an associate at both Sheppard, Mullin, and O'Melveny and Myers. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, guys. Happy to be here.
Really appreciate it. So I think first off, we just wanted to talk to you a bit about your career currently at Netflix. Could you explain just a bit about what it means to be a business and legal affairs executive?
Sure thing. So business and legal affairs are the deal makers and negotiators for feature film product, but also TV content. So oftentimes studios will have a divided business affairs and legal affairs group. Netflix has more of a combined hybrid system. So I do both business affairs and legal affairs. And what that means is, as a business affairs, when I wear my business affairs hat, I'm negotiating the deals, coming up with the terms, structuring and strategizing how the given contract will fit into this, the larger picture of the production. When I put my legal affairs hat on, that's more about reducing those deal terms to a long form contract. And there can be a lot of devil in the details, as I'm sure you can appreciate. So that's its own negotiation in many ways, arguing over small things and what we call in the business negotiated gives. That's sort of the general structure. So at other studios where there are dedicated business affairs and legal affairs execs, what they'll do is the business affairs negotiator will make the deal and then basically pass the file on to their legal affairs team to get the contract drafted and signed.
Great. That's really interesting.
Can I pop in with a question?
Yeah,
actually?
absolutely.
So what are the positives and negatives of combining the business and legal side, and what makes Netflix do that versus other studios keeping them separate?
So I can't really speak to the why. Netflix does it its own way. Oftentimes at smaller companies, it is a combined team. So it's not so unusual at an independent film company or smaller studios. But more traditional studios will have that division in place. Maybe some of it's because in what I'll call the old days, although it's not really that old, oftentimes the business affairs executives weren't lawyers. And to this day, there are still a very small handful of pure business affairs execs who don't have their JDs. And then, whereas the contract drafting, that was seen as something that was really only appropriate for actual, admitted bar members to handle. Why Netflix does it this way, I can't really say. As far as I know, all of the BA team are lawyers. I think that's pretty standard now. But I think that you can argue that there's certainly more ownership of a project, of a contract, as it, if you're drafting it yourself or if you're involved in the long form drafting, you keep a closer eye on it. From my perspective, it can lead to sort of an overwhelming volume of work sometimes because there's dozens and dozens of contracts that need to be negotiated in connection with any project. And if you're also tasked with drafting that can be a pretty long day at the office.
I can imagine that. Well, that's, I think we'd love to talk a bit about the business affairs side right now, just talking about, how a creative executive's idea to get an actor into a project comes to fruition. So I think our first question really is, at what point in the deal are you told to connect with a talent's representatives?
So generally, as you already sort of surmised, the creative exec is at what we call at Netflix the informed captain in many ways. That's our special Netflix jargon. But what it means is that they're the ones who say, we want this person involved. Now it's up to you, BA/BLA, to go get it and make it happen. And that can present some interesting tensions because, nobody likes to tell creatives, well, I couldn't execute on this deal for you, or we weren't able to make it work, or this or that, the other thing. So it becomes kind of an interesting dynamic between, well, we want to deliver for you. We never want to disappoint our creatives. They have the vision creatively for what this project needs to be, whether it's an actor, director, or writer, so on and so forth. But at the same time, it's my job, and I always use the phrase that I'm a responsible steward of company resources. So historically, there was kind of a good cop, bad cop dynamic in place between creatives and the legal side, in terms of, the creative says, let's do this. And then the BA says, well, we'll try if we can, we'll make it work, but they've got to, conform. They, being the other side, has to conform to certain deal making practices, salary expectations, comp expectations, not salary, so on and so forth. So there is a bit of a tension, a dance that goes on. And what generally happens is that in my job, I maintain very close alignment with the creatives. I keep them up to date on the negotiation, each step, to tell them, okay, this is where we are. This is what we think our max is. Before I even get into the negotiation, I'll have a conversation with them about, this is how we see this thing playing out. And then it becomes a very close collaboration between the creative side and the legal side, including BA, to execute on the contract. And, oftentimes what will wind up happening is you have to loop in the creative exec to basically call the reps on the other side and say, no, really, we're done, or we're holding the line here, or you're getting greedy, or so on and so forth. Because me saying that, first of all, I have to sort of watch what I say during the course of a negotiation. I don't want to say you're being greedy.
Yeah.
But the creatives can say that, no problem. So it's like, we have our roles and our hats that we wear, and somehow at the end of it, we generally come out with a deal. And, I'm sure you've heard the old cliche, which is, a good negotiation is one where neither side comes out totally happy. And I live by those words.
That's awesome. Can you walk us through a little bit of like a typical order of operations, or like a life cycle? Like, in terms of a whole project, is there like a typical starting point? You guys start with like writers, directors, actors, or just give us some insight into that?
Sure. So usually the very first deal that needs to be made will be the rights, assuming that there's an intake of rights. So that can be a book option, or a remake of a film, or a comic book, or whatever it is that is the source material. As I'm sure you're aware, these days in Hollywood, there tends to be an allergy to totally fresh intellectual property. There used to be a fairly robust spec script market, and what that is that means a spec script is just a script that a writer wrote on his or her own and put it out there into the world for sale. And there used to be a robust market for those kinds of original properties. That's really, really diminished in the past few decades. But not saying it never happens, but it's a lot less common. We're in an era of franchise IP where everything but most folks tend to be more comfortable investing resources, including time and lots of money, into the exploitation of IP that's already been successful in some other forum, whether it's a book or otherwise. So the first deal is the rights, assuming that's applicable. Then what we'll typically do is we'll start attaching the creative elements. Now, if a producer brought in the rights deal is attached to the rights, typically the producer deal will follow pretty quickly. Oftentimes I'm negotiating multiple deals in connection with sort of what we call a package at once. So for example, I've been working on one project now where it's book rights. It was previously set up at another studio, so you have to negotiate the intake of rights from the other studio. There's multiple producers attached to it, so I had to negotiate all of their deals. There is an acting talent involved, so I had to try to negotiate that deal. Although sometimes if you do that early on, it's fairly premature.
Mhm.
So I think there's more, you're on sounder footing if you well, I don't want to say that. It can go either way, whether it makes more sense to negotiate the actor deal and lock that in now, or not get over your skis on that and wait until there's actually a real script to read, see how it's shaping up, because you're sort of balancing risk. On the one side, you could overpay for a talent now. On the other hand, you could lock them in at a, quote unquote, reasonable rate now. On the other hand, you're also setting their quote expectations effectively prematurely. So, there's a chance the market for that actor could change when you actually have the work in a more developed form. So it's a question of strategy, and there's no single right answer to that. Although I will say that I think probably the safer bet is to not negotiate actor deals until you know what's going on with the project. That's my personal preference. Other reasonable minds may disagree, and sometimes you have to do what you have to do, because that's, if the actor is coming in with the project, oftentimes there's an expectation. And when I say actor, by the way, I'm saying actor or actress. It's, these days in Hollywood, the term has become more unisex. So, so that's typically the general order. I mean, oftentimes it can be linear, but more oftentimes it's more of a cluster where I'm negotiating 5 or 6 deals in connection with any project at once.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's all very circumstantial, just of course, project by project basis. That's really interesting to hear yours from the studio's perspective. Something that I guess I know you mentioned with acting deals, it's compensation, not salary.
Right.
How do you typically determine a number, or a figure to come in with to present to a talent's representatives?
Yeah, that's the real trick. So this is where sort of time and experience in the business just sort of is the informing factor. It's definitely more art than science, and sometimes it's very messy art. Typically, first of all, it used to be back in the old days, i.e. before, I think it was 2017, you could just ask people what they made. And you'd ask for the studio quote, and they'd tell you, and you'd say, okay, great, I'll give you, a nickel more than that. Nowadays, there are restrictions, legal restrictions on asking for that sort of information. Certainly making it a term of employment. I believe that's the way the law is phrased, that you can't demand previous salary information as a term of engagement. However, in real practice, you can ask and just say, is there anything that might be helpful to help us cut through this? Because nobody wants to be, well, let me put it this way. Nobody on the studio side wants to be taken for a ride. On the other hand, nobody on the talent side wants to be underpaid. So there's a definite dance there. It helps if you've made deals with that talent, whether it's actor, director, writer, producer at your studio, because then you can just look in the file and see, okay, here's what we paid this person on the last go round. That was 2 years ago. They haven't had anything made. That project that we made that deal on is still in development. So there we go. We can just dupe and revise that deal and, be off to the races. More often than not, you can start with that, but then they'll be, the other side's like, well, that was 3 years ago, and, their stock has risen. And even though they haven't received a credit as a writer on a movie since then, they've written on all these projects. And so it becomes a negotiation. But I spend a lot of time researching, whether it's my files or, scouring internet sources like IMDb or Studio System to try to figure out, okay, what's happened to these, where can I estimate what these budgets are, what their fair compensation is. I always like to say in negotiations, I'm never trying to set somebody back in their career. So if they've been paid X, I'm not going to try to pay them S. There are exceptions to that. Sometimes they were paid X on a $250 million budget movie, and here we're making a $25 million movie. So there should be some play for the budget itself. And obviously the budget of the film is a key determining factor in how you approach any negotiation. But those are kind of, it's like a balancing act of all these different considerations.
Can we back up a sec to what changed back in 2017? So that was there some new kind of legislation where you can't ask for salaries?
Yeah, in California, and I think it was 2017. My mind's a little hazy on that. I believe it was 2017 though. There was a state law enacted that made it unlawful to require evidence or to make that that inquiry as a part of the employment negotiation. So there's artful ways of maybe alighting the strict four corners of the law. But generally speaking, you're not supposed to insist on it as a part of the negotiation. And now, granted, that law was passed to protect folks who aren't typically making millions of dollars a movie.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of, it's not really, folks in this business are not generally who that law was premised to protect, but we're all living in California, or at least I am. And, we have to make do.
Has a similar law been passed in New York, where a lot of other talent agencies have offices, where that could still impact them? Or is it just understood at this point, you don't ask for a quote, don't even risk it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I absolutely 100% should know the answer to it. And I confess that I don't. I think it's possible that there is a New York analogous law, but the truth is it doesn't matter because even most of the talent that I deal with are represented in California. Most of the agencies have LA offices anyway, so you can just there's sort of a loose jurisdictional argument even for actors who are based in New York. They'll have a vacation home in Malibu or something like that, and we're all in California in the entertainment industry.
You'd only be so lucky.
Planet Hollywood.
Yeah. So something else that we were interested in, obviously being at Netflix, groundbreaking streaming platform, we would imagine that the way that deals are formulated differ than that from a traditional studio, say an NBC Universal, where they have theatrical rollouts planned as opposed to just straight to streaming, although of course that's changing with Peacock. So how does compensation get affected while working as a streamer as opposed to a legacy studio?
Yeah, it's you're totally right in your assumptions that there are fairly significant differences between the two. Traditional studios had a back end component where let's say you're an actor, you'd get a certain net percentage of the box office, which that percentage is run through this incredibly esoteric algorithmic calculation and definition of what net means, such that most people didn't actually get net. But it's a good way of just establishing a threshold for back end compensation. Oftentimes there'd also be box office bonuses based on the performance of the movie. Netflix doesn't do that. So since Netflix started making original films some years ago, it's done what is called the buyout. And the buyout is shorthand for buyout of contingent compensation. And what it basically is it's a lump sum that's negotiated upfront. It's not payable all at once necessarily, although I think some of the other streamers do it differently. Basically, upon the release of the movie, in addition to what's called your fixed compensation, which is what you get paid over the course of production of the film, then upon release, you get this other chunk of money that's intended to be reflective of, contingent, back end compensation, box office bonuses, typically it would be inclusive of, merchandise royalties or whatever else might be in that pot of things, of profits or income that could be generated from a theatrical release. So Netflix, that's a separate negotiation. It's kind of you have your fixed comp, but then we negotiate the buyout. And I think for folks like me who came from more traditional, theatrical release backgrounds, there's something lost there, just in terms of being able to properly incentivize performance. And maybe it's not even that, it's that it's a more calculated risk outcome. So, if the movie doesn't perform, you're not then paying potentially significant amounts of money to the talent. Whereas at Netflix, because we have the contingent comp buyout, those folks are entitled to sometimes very hefty sums, regardless of whether the movie performs well on our service or not. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Namely, Netflix is fairly protective of its data and its metrics. And so that's fairly proprietary information. And we don't want to open the robe too much to other folks, because that would mean potentially competitors on how many people watch a movie, or, how much it made for the company, so on and so forth. So we've gone with this buyout approach. I think my prediction is that at some point in the future, I don't know when, we will start to move towards more of a performance-based contingent compensation, but there's no immediate plans for it. But to me, it just makes sense as, somebody who sees, how things go. I think there's a real value in having that second payment tied to how a film does.
So does that calculus change when, I know some streamers, Netflix included, will have theatrical releases prior to its appearance on a streamer? For example, Knives Out 2 had, I believe, a theatrical release. Is there any contingent compensation from that where the metrics are known? Box office numbers are made public, or does it still remain a buyout regardless?
Typically, it still remains a buyout. I believe, my understanding, and it's an informed understanding, is that Netflix's theatrical releases are limited. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, they're seen as either promotional or for awards consideration. And that's kind of it. Netflix is dedicated to keeping its subscribers, its members, happy by always having a new supply of exciting content to keep our subscribers feeling like they're getting real value for their monthly subscription fee, to help boost their engagement with the platform. We want the members talking about this great thing they just saw on Netflix and that they can only find on Netflix. So that's really sort of a top-down strategy from the Ted Sarandoses and Reed Hastings of the world on down to us. So I don't know how Amazon and Apple do it. I know that recently, in the past few weeks particularly, there's been a lot of news about how both of those studios are going to be leaning more towards a theatrical release model. So my assumption is that they'll have kind of a bifurcated structure where there's a traditional theatrical contingent compensation negotiation, and then maybe on top of that, a something for the streaming side of things. But I only know my own company's inner workings at the moment.
Another thing that we were interested in terms of like the negotiations were awards bonuses. So I guess, like, how do you set the bar for an actor or a director in terms of an awards bonus, and how do you structure that portion of the deal?
Yeah, I mean, that's typically a fairly, I don't want to say routine thing, because we don't do them so often. Mm-hmm. But if the film is likely to garner some sort of awards consideration, we're open to that discussion. And typically all it is it's a two-prong deal where it's, you get this much if the movie is nominated and this much if it wins. So it's like, $50K if you get a nomination and another 75 or 100K if you win. In recent years, there's been more discussion about what awards would qualify for a bonus. So it used to be Oscars and Golden Globes. Golden Globes, maybe not so much now anymore. It sort of depends. So there's, always an ongoing conversation about, well, do Golden Globes really matter? Do we want to be associated with the Golden Globes? Netflix, I think, has been sort of sitting out of the Golden Globes consideration, or at least not putting any promotional, marketing budget into the Golden Globes because it's been sort of a tainted brand for the last little while. Or at least it's been controversial. I don't want to use the word tainted. It's been a controversial organization, the Hollywood Foreign Press. So typically I personally like to, if we're doing those kind of bonuses, I would limit it to Oscars, Academy Awards consideration. Sometimes there'll be, maybe a BAFTA. Sometimes there will be Golden Globes, but it just kind of depends. They're not very common, though. Typically, those are reserved for a certain type of film.
It's interesting to hear, I guess, how ad hoc some of, really the whole process is, because it's all circumstantial depending on how the project comes in, who comes with it attached. I think the final thing with regards to the business affairs side for acting specifically that we're interested in is, how do you determine credit? Is that determination solely made by a creative executive? We know Knives Out 2, of course, it's Daniel Craig. He was at the forefront at the beginning, but it was also a major ensemble cast. So we're just very interested in learning a bit about how you make that determination.
Yeah, that's all part of the overall negotiation. It can be really fraught on an ensemble piece, for example. Typically, who the lead, like the 1 and 2 stars are, and you have those pieces hammered out. Most BA executives will then try to limit anything past 1 and 2 contractually and leave it at the studio's discretion. So, sometimes the talent rep will say, no, you're putting this person only behind, the first 2 people on the call sheet, Daniel Craig and whoever was second on Knives Out. So it just depends, as you noted, Richard. It can be very circumstantial, but typically the studio likes to have the say in that, because things can change over the course of production. Oftentimes roles will be cut out entirely, or sometimes what was intended to be basically a cameo will blossom into something more, more prominent over the course of production. It really changes. So the more discretion the studio has to decide, okay, this is where we should put this person in the billing block, the better. But kind of the ancillary conversation that happens is in the nitty gritty of things. It's not just the placement, the order of the actor's name, but whether they on screen have a single card or share a card with other actors. Those are the 2 main considerations. It's single card, and then in what order? Single or shared card, and then what order?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm
glad you think so.
We wouldn't have reached out if we didn't think so.
Yeah. Well, so that I kind of wanted to pivot a little bit and move into more of the directing side and talk about like what kinds of things are different from acting deals, and how do you negotiate things like development fees and ratings and the budget.
And we know that development fees have been going out of favor a little bit historically, depending on the case. So we'd love to hear just a bit about, your take at Netflix.
Yeah, generally speaking, if the director is sort of the primary developing person on the picture, or is staying with the picture for a long time, let's say there's no script written, but it comes in with a producer and a director. The question is, okay, do they both get development fees, or do we make them share the development fee pot? And that's, typically development fees are limited at 25K. So, I mean, which it's certainly a substantial sum of money to most people, but when you're talking, millions of dollars of payday, it becomes an easier calculation to make, because what you're talking about is 25K, and typically I like to limit it to one pot of 25K for the producers and the directors, but I certainly have done plenty of times where the producer gets 25K, the director gets 25K.
Right.
That's payable half, so 12.5 on either the signature of usually a long form agreement. We like to get people signed to the whole long form first. Sometimes it'll be what's called a certificate, which is a short piece of paper that just gives us all right to what are called the results and proceeds of the artist talent production work. So it means we own whatever it is that they're putting into the picture, and then the long form will follow with all the contractual, credit terms and travel and things like that. The caveat to that is that if the director is actually writing the movie and or the producer for that matter, if the producer is actually being paid to write the film, I don't like to give a development fee, because then it's like you're sort of double paying them for the same role, which is creating a vision of the project.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I never thought about it like that, how the development fee and the writing fees they do overlap. That's exactly what they are doing.
Yeah. So, I mean, and most seasoned reps will know not to ask for a development fee if their artist is also rendering writing services in connection with the film. That's just fairly routine.
So with regards to a writing deal, we know a bit about that there's guaranteed steps versus optional steps. From the studio's perspective, would you be willing to explain a bit just which steps you prefer to have optional versus guaranteed, and how many steps? And for the sake of clarity, could you describe, I guess, what a step is?
Yeah. So a step is the incremental. Well, let me see if I can come up with the definition on the fly. A step is the increment of writing services that a writer will deliver. So it could be a treatment. It could be a first draft. It could be a set of revisions on that first draft. Now, the important question that is a guiding factor in this negotiation is whether they're doing a first draft or whether it's a rewrite. More often than not, just because of the way things go, you're talking about rewrites of other writers' work. So what is customary in a deal depends mostly on whether it's a rewrite or a first draft. For your garden variety, plain vanilla first draft, what we would typically get is what's called a draft and a set, and those are guaranteed. So that's a first draft screenplay and then a rewrite of that screenplay. And I believe that's because the Writers Guild has protections that says like the original writer of a project is entitled to the first rewrite of that project. So that's a draft and a set. And oftentimes what BAs like me, business affairs executives, will do is we'll come up with a single number for that draft and set. It's kind of a shorthand. So you'll say, okay, it's $300K for a draft and a set. And then when you get into the long form, what you'll wind up doing is bickering about, well, how much of that is allocated to the first draft and how much of that is allocated to the rewrite. I like to go 60-40, but sometimes you'll land closer to 70-30. I try to keep it at 65-35, and I'm talking percentages here in terms of what the allocation is. So you always get a draft and a set on a first draft, and then typically you'll do an optional rewrite and an optional polish. So those things are, an optional rewrite is another second rewrite of the script. A polish is a more contained, narrow sort of pass at the script, and the Writers Guild has more specific definitions of what all these things are. I'm not so conversant in the differences between them, other than a polish is less. And one thing that I like to insist on in my deals is that I want the studio to have the freedom to skip the rewrite, the optional rewrite, if we just need a polish. I don't like having my hands tied. Oftentimes the talent rep, the writer's rep will say, well, no, you can only exercise these optional steps in order, meaning you have to go through the rewrite in order to get to the polish. And typically where I'll land is no, but if we go to the polish, then we can't go back to the rewrite. That's kind of the customary dance that happens here. So you've got the guaranteed set, the guaranteed first draft, the guaranteed rewrite, optional steps, and then you negotiate what are called the credit bonuses. And this is what the writer is paid if they're accorded either sole credit by the WGA, the Writers Guild, or shared credit. They share credit with some other writer, subsequent or previous. And so typically the way it works is, I think the customary sort of doctrinal approach is that the credit bonus, the sole credit bonus, will be 2 times the amount of the guaranteed fees. So let's say it's $300K for the draft and set. It'll be against, and then you'll throw in some optional steps at lower increments. It'll be against a $600K sole credit bonus, with 50% of that remainder being the shared credit award. That's kind of the typical approach. Now, things can get really wild. So if you're paying a writer $1 million or $1.5 million for a draft and set, you don't want their sole credit bonus to necessarily be $3 million less sums paid. So then you can start tweaking the formula. Maybe it's less than 2x. Maybe it's, it becomes, again, more art than science. On a rewrite situation, if you're hiring a writer to rewrite, oftentimes what I like to do is do flat bonuses, because it's kind of a different situation and you want to limit your exposure on the bonus side. And oftentimes, especially for if it's an original screenplay, there's almost no chance that a subsequent writer will get sole credit. So rather than inflate their sole credit quote, you focus on what the shared credit bonus will really be. And you almost treat the sole credit award as almost an afterthought. You concentrate your analysis and your calculations on what that shared credit bonus will be.
That's really interesting that the credit is determined by the WGA.
Mm-hmm, always.
Writers, versus, like, I guess with actors, like we were talking about before, that's a negotiated term. So how did that come about?
Literally, this is what the Writers Guild was started for. Wow. So I think it was in the 30s, the Guild formed together to make sure that writers were properly receiving credit for their work in Hollywood. And what typically happens is, it's really easy if, like, a writer, if there's only been one writer on the project, you have a pretty good sense going in who's going to wind up with credit. Mm-hmm. It's a lot less clear when there are 4, 5, 6, or many more. I mean, I just closed a writer negotiation on Thursday on a project where, let's see, I think there have been like 7 sets of writers.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a long development history on this project. It's been around for a while. And so that and it was an original spec. So that the first writer who came up with the idea, in this case, it's a he, will get shared credit at a minimum. But then it's a question of what other writers will be recognized by the WGA. So what happens in those situations is it's totally out of the studio hands. The Guild makes a determination about who receives that credit. Typically, it's done through an arbitration where a panel of 3 screenwriters will review all the drafts of the scripts that constitute the final product, and come up with their assessment of whose contribution should be recognized in a credit. One more little nuance is that oftentimes writers work as a team. So if you see on screen or in posters, there's a difference between the word and, A and D, and an ampersand. because if it's two writers separated by an ampersand, that means they wrote as a team, versus and the word and, that means that they were engaged separately or ad seriatim to work on the project. So there can even be an outcome where the guild's determination will be written by John Smith and the letter word and John Smith and Jane Doe with an ampersand, so it can get very weird, but so that's just kind of a thing to sort of, next time you watch a movie, keep an eye on the writing credit and see if there's an and or an ampersand in there, and that'll give you some tale of who was writing with whom and how many people may have come on board.
Well, when we publish our podcast, we'll have to be sure to put mine and Mike's name with an ampersand so everyone knows that
just so.
Yeah. Actually, while we're on the discussion of the WGA, I know that it's been made a lot in the news recently that the contract is expiring coming up soon, and that the WGA, I believe, recently put a vote as to whether a strike will be approved, and it was fairly overwhelmingly
98%.
Yes, 98%. That's right. How will this strike impact your projects that are currently in motion?
It's not great.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not taking a position on the writers, entitlement to advocate for better compensation, conditions, pension, residuals, whatever is on the menu. That's not what I'm talking about. But from a studio perspective, it could be very difficult. We won't be able to make new deals. Mm-hmm. We can't have the writers who we've already paid to start on projects do further work. Now, query whether those writers might be spending the strike working on projects anyway. But that's, outside of my purview. And so there's going to be a freeze, effectively, for the most part, on new writing deals, new writing engagements. It's pencils down, basically. So scripts won't be delivered to studios. So I think a lot of studios have been trying to get their scripts into as good of a shape as possible leading up to that period. When, this, as you said, the contract expires May 1st. So at any time after May 2nd, the strike could be declared. I think as of right now, I think most people have later that week as the date, like the end of that week, but it could go sooner. Now there are limited options available to the studio in the meantime. So for example, there's what's called A through H services, and I'll explain what that means. If you are not a member of the guild, if you're a producer or a director and you're not a writer who's a member of the guild, you can perform limited writing services on the project in your capacity as a producer or director. Those are called the A through H. Actually, I've got a rundown of it somewhere here. Okay. So it would be things like cutting for time, bridging material necessitated by cutting for time, changes in technical or stage directions, assignment of lines due to other existing characters occasioned by cast changes, continuity changes, casual minor adjustments in dialogue, and instructions made to a writer regarding a screenplay. So those kind of services can be done still, but they can only be done if you're not a writer. So for example, if you hire a writer-director to direct your film, even if the director didn't write the movie, he or she can't do those writing services because they would be considered writing services. But if they're not a member of the guild, he or she can do those incidental small tweaks to the script during production, which I think a lot of studios will probably be leaning into. Then there's the question of using non-guild talent. The Writers Guild strike rules will prohibit non-guild members from working on guild projects. And there's kind of there's another strike rule that guild members are supposed to report non-guild members rendering services. and that could potentially blackball them from future inclusion in the guild. So there's a lot of incentive for everybody in town to not work as a writer at this time. But the guild is the Writers Guild of America. So if you're non-guild living in, the UK or something like that, you're under a different set of rules and restrictions, and that may also be helpful to some producers.
Just out of curiosity, those A through H guidelines that you mentioned, is that something that, if you would know, defined by the WGA prior to the strike, or is it read more so by studios reading the guild's agreement saying, okay, these are where, I guess, the areas in which we could still have some work done to the project's script?
Yeah. A through H is part of the WGA minimum basic agreement. So they call it the minimum basic agreement, but it's actually this giant book.
Yeah.
And it's in Article 1. It's Article 1, A through H, and those are defined as not writing services. And then the overlay of that is the strike rules will say, but if you're a member of the guild, you can't participate in those A through H services.
All right, so I guess once a contract is moving away from this WGA stuff, once the contract is once you're signed and ready to go, what happens if talent doesn't sign? I guess not really once you're signed, but what happens if a talent doesn't sign prior to the start of principal photography?
It's a good question. A lot of studios don't have signed agreements policies, or at least some do, some don't. So oftentimes, either they'll proceed on a certificate of results and proceeds, or just the act of issuing a draft contract can sort of have people limp in. My studio, Netflix, strictly follows a signed agreements policy. So I will, we don't allow talent to go on camera unless they've signed their contract. And there's a bunch of reasons why we would do that, but namely it's that we want to be able to say you're in breach of your contract by not showing up on such and such a day. And so sometimes there can be some pretty late nights or very early mornings as we try to make that happen. And sometimes it can be a real challenge where, let's say you've been negotiating, sometimes these contracts don't really come down to the wire, the negotiation of them. And they'll be approved for signature the night before the talent is supposed to go on camera. But I've had situations where, say, the director is already on location in Iceland, on some glacier. I'm not even joking. This happened on one of my movies.
Oh my gosh.
And you're like, okay, how do we get it signed? And, sometimes it's a matter of, them scribbling their name, with a Bic ballpoint pen and then taking a photo of the signature page, and we'll use that photo as proof of signature for the time being. And these days, more often than not, these signatures are done by DocuSign, which makes it a lot easier, but you can still be in a place with limited cell service, and sometimes talent aren't so digital friendly and they're not quite sure what to do, even though DocuSign literally just requires you kind of mashing a button here and there. So, but it can be it's a real pressure point in the overall, both in the contract negotiation is the timing, but also in terms of just the production. It can be a stressful, period when you're trying to get that signature and, you're having problems.
I guess what are the remedies that you have as a studio if there's a breach? And from a realistic perspective, do you really want to be litigating against people who you want to have repeat business with?
And the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really think of, I'm sure there are, but it's rare for a studio to sue talent. Mm-hmm. What's more often is that it becomes kind of a leverage point where you're like, you are in breach of this contract. We can withhold payment. We can suspend your contract. There's a whole host of remedies set forth in the contract, suspend, terminate, whatever. But really all it adds up to, Michael, as you kind of intuited, it's a relationship that is the guiding force in these contracts and in the way that producers and studios conduct themselves with talent. And you need to sort of keep one eye on that ball at all times. Is how are we, my old mentor had this great saying, he was an agent, and he used to say, so you get to be right, so what? And that's kind of I live with that in the back of my head a lot of the time. It's like, yeah, we may be right by the letter of the contract, but we still have this, $45 million, $90 million, $200 million movie, and we need this actor to show up on set. So then it becomes a question of, well, what are you going to do to keep that person happy? Does it mean an extra box of chocolates in their trailer? Does it mean, an extra round trip ticket home? Does it mean, hypothetically, we fly them by private jet somewhere? It all just depends. And these are the delightful complications that come in a high touch relationship driven business.
Well, Jeffrey, we really appreciate the time, just walking through everything. This has been so illuminating and fascinating. One question that I guess we have, just from a kind of more macroscopic standpoint, is, do you have any advice for future lawyers who are interested in pursuing work at a studio?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, it's always helpful to get some experience. I would even say before law school. So maybe you spend a summer or a year out of college working at one of the agencies or a production company. If you want to be a lawyer, maybe try to get a job at one of the boutique talent firms or a law firm that specializes in talent. Oftentimes, folks like me come from bigger law firms and have worked their way to the studios or production companies. And there's no one path. Each one is very different. My background's very kind of loop-de-loop in terms of how I got to where I am. But ultimately, you want to do great in law school. You want to build up some relevant experience in the business so that you can both point to some relevant experience on your resume, but also so you're developing your network of contacts, because that is truly the most important part of the business. Not just getting in, but staying in, is developing meaningful relationships with people at all levels. So I do that. That's something that I take great pride in. And part of that's in terms of being a hard worker and doing excellent work, but it's also being kind to folks, comporting yourself with integrity, being as good of a trading partner as you can in this business.
No, that's awesome.
I guess I just have one more question.
Sure.
Is there anything you recommend that we watch right now?
Well, Love is Blind season 4 was total banger.
Loved it.
I still need to see it.
Oh, Tiffany and Brett. I mean, they're so cute. So stuff to watch. So here's my dark, dirty secret. I don't watch too much because I work very hard. And by the time I'm done with my very hard work day, first of all, I've got to spend some time with my kids and my wife. So I tend to try to refresh myself by not sitting in front of the tube. So I'll read a book or maybe play some music or something like that. But in terms of, something good to watch, I'm just going to have to take a powder on that right now, because
Love is Blind season 4.
Love is Blind season 4. Give it a shot. It's a great palate cleanser.
Love it.
Totally unscripted, of course, but
of course
doesn't help me out much. But yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much once again, Jeffrey. This was a great conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank
you.